Okay, so going to be going over the highlights of the lecture, Archetypes of the Collective Unconscious by Jung. This is part of the collected works. It's in part one, Archetypes and the Collective Unconscious, which is part one of volume 9 of the collected works. Okay, so I thought there was enough in this to give it a video. So yeah, like I said, highlights and commentary from my point of view. It's not going to really be a summary. I'm going to assume that you kind of already know what's going on with Jung and his thoughts. Although I will be getting into that because it is interesting. So what he thinks archetypes are these parts of reality and are symbols or images, or he'll say even dogma of the church, are ways of expressing the archetypes. This itself is kind of, it seems sloppy because, eventually he'll say there's an archetype of life, an archetype of meaning, the wise old man, the mother, the sleeping beauty, etc., etc. And these are all archetypes too. But it seems like if he was being consistent, he would say that these are symbols, and there's some kind of inexpressible archetype behind them, because that's what it seems like he wants to say. The archetypes are parts of reality, and reality to Jung seems to be this realm of chaos where all opposites are just relative and all opposites are integrated. There's no good or bad, really. Everything's integrated. Everything is unique and novel and original, and also it's terrifying and dangerous and violent. These all seem to be, in this lecture at least, how he describes reality, where the archetypes are. And he'll be talking about how man needs like a filter for this reality, this apiron, as one of the pre-Socratics put it. I think it was Anaximander. And he also calls this the unconscious. But a portion of reality is in consciousness, right? So he doesn't call it completely unreal what's in our consciousness. But we use dogma or symbols, or later he'll call them mystery rites, antique mysteries. And this is what give the archetypes form. They're also a filter. They act as a kind of wall or gate, or he'll even say channel. So it mostly blocks off the unconsciousness, but allows some of it through. So basically it's a way of controlling the unconscious, this wilderness. But he describes this process basically in historical determinist terms, this process of these symbols stiffening into mere objects of belief. We become overly familiar with them. They become religion instead of spirituality. So we kind of see the beginning of that here. And eventually these images or symbols, which are our walls, become more and more abstract and lifeless and stiff, and eventually useless. So he mentions, like, or he uses the example of 3 different Christian seminarians or their theologians, or both. And he's each time I think they're Protestants. Maybe one of them was a Catholic, I don't remember, but he does talk about Protestantism and give it its own, commentary here. And he describes Protestantism as this iconoclasm which emptied out these images and symbols, until it's this, antiseptic, overly clean, lifeless, kind of symbolic order. And I think that's true uh, of Protestantism, but he describes it as it's like this inevitable process that we get to that point, kind of like the Kali Yuga. This kind of notion of a cyclical history seems to be at work in Jung here. So there's no notion of what I'm about to talk about, what he's going to talk about, the individuation process, or confronting your shadow, and then the anima, and then the self. There's no notion of going into those depths, and yet it being the same as going into the tradition and retrieving the tradition. He mentions the East. I think he even mentions, kind of in an indirect way, Eastern Orthodoxy, but describes it as somehow alien to the West, as not belonging to us, and what we need to do as Western Europeans is accept our spiritual poverty, the symbolic poverty of our culture, and go through this process. But nowhere does he say that that can look like basically returning to traditional Eastern Orthodox Christianity. So that's, I mean, it's very apparent that he's anti-Christian in this. It's very apparent that he is assuming atheism, not just atheism, right? But he's assuming, relative to Christianity, an atheism. And he looks pretty steeply down on these Christians that he's talking about as being held back by their Christianity, being unable to confront the shadow, cross the river in the gorge, as he puts it in as it shows up in one of the dreams of the seminarian or theologian. They're just unable to mature, and that's a theme in psychoanalysis. It's in Freud too, and I think we should always remember that this isn't an argument for their view. They're just presupposing their view. If you're going to presuppose your view and look at a Christian as a non-Christian, you're going to see this, unless there's some other specific doctrine that you hold to that prevents this. Like, besides atheism, he's a perennialist. That becomes very, very clear. All religions are, like I said, these things that can get worn out. They're all interchangeable. They all just serve this function of harnessing the unconsciousness, like controlling it and not letting it get out of control. And this unconscious reality really is the basis for all these different religions anyway. That's where we get those symbols. Maybe there is something that the conscious ego does in its relation to the unconscious, which gives those particular symbols. But I didn't see any of that in this lecture. I didn't quite see what the particular role of the consciousness was. Although he does say that it's necessary, we need to have consciousness, we need to gain control over the unconsciousness, or else it's pathology, it's non-integration, it's being out of balance, it's either neurosis or psychosis. Uh, yeah. So in sum, Jung is presupposing some kind of atheism, perennialist, I guess I would say, is what it is. Whether Jung really believed that or not, I don't know. I think we should remember Jung was an agent of the OSS, Agent 488, recruited by Alan Dulles. And I think it would be a bit naive to just kind of take everything that an intelligence agent says at face value and believe it. This is, I think, what he's giving, he might not even really believe. Just a possibility. What he's giving here in this lecture is one of the changing images of man, one of the new images of man that everyone else is supposed to have, but not him and the people in the know. Just, we should be aware that that's a possibility. I mean, because what's another thing that really we can't get behind here is this constant, like, I mean, it's interesting. Let's presuppose Christianity, and let's stop kind of giving the benefit of the doubt and interpreting charitably, and kind of reciprocate. What would that be like if we did that? Well, I think, and this isn't against Jung per se, but it's against kind of what he's peddling, what he's giving us here. There's this, I would say, the puer aeternus, the Peter Pan complex, is in this whole pretending to be beyond opposites. Paragraph 31, he speaks of this wisdom was good and that was bad. That's a delusion. True and false wisdom, good and bad wisdom is a delusion. You're supposed to kind of, accept everything in this giant blob or something. That sounds like the undifferentiatedness of the child that doesn't mature, right? I mean, later he says the old man, the sage, is alchemically the same as the child. There's aspects of this I can accept, but it's all so unclear that, let's just look at this face value. He also says, paragraph 45, after the door of the shadow is a place where there is no good or bad, no mine or thine, right? Paragraph 59, life itself is both good and bad. Kind of duh, yeah. Paragraph 60, she is beyond, speaking of the anima, she is beyond all categories and can dispense with blame as well as praise. Paragraph 74, the serpent is both the serpent in the garden and the one who leads to redemption through the Son of God. Also, he says the archetype of meaning is the archetype of the old man or sage, which is the archetype of the spirit, which is where he associates with Lucifer. Paragraph 76, he says good and evil function together. And he cites approvingly the Hindu doctrine of Nirdvandva, freedom from opposites. So, maybe there's some kind of mystical perennialist who's very wise and we can learn a lot from. Maybe Jung is one of those guys. But as far as I've seen this manifest in the culture, is you just get edgelords, kind of people who think that they're beyond it all. Isn't that what this gives us? If you don't really go into the deeper stuff here in Jung, or in any particular tradition, and you just kind of take from the surface. I'm saying that's what you get. Now I tried to cease giving the benefit of the doubt to Jung, but again I've accorded probably too much respect if I'm going to be assuming my worldview. So yeah, honestly, can you be beyond good and evil? This is stupid. This is a lecture. Again, I'm not sure where this lecture happened, but he's maybe a good rhetorician and he's simplifying a lot. So it's hard to stop giving the benefit of the doubt here. But I would say this kind of Jungianism, what usually comes out of it is a kind of immaturity. It's basically not understanding that fixed concepts of right and wrong are not necessarily what you believe as a moral realist, right? Because you can be a moral realist and believe that there is stance independent right or wrong, good or bad, what you ought to do, and not believe in some kind of right and wrong algorithm where you just apply an algorithm and then out pops out, this is right, this is wrong. Instead, you can accept the phronesis of Aristotle, or judgment, which has to be developed through experience, and see the particularities of the situation and weigh the non-moral factors according to kind of a general template of an order of values, where that general template has some flexibility. This is, I can't get into this right now, but in analytic terms, you can be a particularist, a moral particularist, or even a, which I might side more with W.D. Ross, who was an Aristotelian as well, which is just a moral pluralist. You don't have to be a utilitarian or Kantian or one of these folks who thinks that there's a general formula that you just apply. So that you get rid of the fixed ideas of right and wrong, like it's always supposed to look a certain way. And once you do that, people like Jung, who scorn philosophy, don't understand that that doesn't entail moral nihilism. It just entails that you don't have an algorithm to figure it out, that there's no fixed ideas for it. You know, there's no categorical imperative, which I'm sure Jung was aware of, that's going to solve all of the moral situations and quandaries that we get into. Anyway, so that was my attempt to stop according the benefit of the doubt and respecting the interlocutor or person of a different perspective like Jung. Unfortunately, I think it's just I can't go all the way and reduce the other side to just what I think that they're saying. You know, give a straw man. It's just part of the Christian way, I think, to respect the freedom of the other, their freedom to see things differently, even though I would say they're not seeing things right in the end. Still, there's a providential purpose for them to see things that way, and there is truth to it. And in the different religions or traditions, certain truths can be expressed even better than in my own tradition. For example, I mean, my own example, Epictetus's handbook, the first entry in that is one of the most beautiful ways I've seen that insight expressed. Okay, so back to the text a bit. He speaks of Protestantism as completing a nihilistic process of iconoclasm that destroys all symbols. He warns against Western man surrendering to Eastern ways. And that would include Eastern Orthodoxy, by the way. He doesn't want that. He continually speaks of this process of letting the house of our fathers fall into decay, paragraph 28, as historically determined. Or as if he is a historical determinist, because he nowhere suggests that we can recover the tradition, and only ever speaks of this as part of an archetypal, hence necessary process or cycle. Right. So then he talks about the theologian, his dream, that, okay, what this Protestant, this Western man needs to do is go down to the water, admit your spiritual poverty, right? Then go down to the water or abyss, look into it. It's like a mirror, and you are supposed to see yourself, but people avoid this because it will show them parts of themselves that they don't want to see. This is his, infamous shadow concept. Mainly, the shadow is composed of the dangerous, immoral, violent aspects of the self, which, he's saying this Protestant Christianity has totally denied, and you're not supposed to accept it as part of yourself. But Jung wants to say, no, there's always this, as Alan Watts would say, the rascal, the irreducible, ineliminable rascality within us. And he will later say, even in the Bible, there's certain things like the heart is the source of all evil thoughts. He'll speak of the parable of the unjust steward as parts of the Bible that are kind of not so clear, not so rigid with what's good and evil. Even Nietzsche accepted the Old Testament as like, rah, rah, this is your awesome warrior society. And ironically, it's the Gnostic, like Marcion, who wants to reject that Old Testament God as a brute. I say ironic because the Gnostics are who Jung wants to go back to. So we have Nietzsche, one of Jung's influences, and the Gnostics as one of Jung's influences. I don't know how he reconciles this, but Nietzsche is like Old Testament good, and then a Gnostic like Marcion says Old Testament bad. So which one is it? I'm not sure. I haven't gone that far into Jung. Returning to this, another big part of confronting the shadow is admitting your helplessness to solve the problem that arises in your life. Once you admit your helplessness, you're then open to a helpful idea from the intuition. He claims prayer is similar to this openness. Okay, then it's the next step, which is to look behind the reflection or shadow for the entities there. He's talking about like these symbols of like fishes or nixies. And then this is the anima. He starts describing that. And he's quite literal about the word there, the Latin, which is soul. He describes it as the breath breathed into Adam by the Spirit, but he also compares it with Eve in her role as seductress or as a temptation. So it's also this raison d'être or reason to live, and yet it's also kind of genetically in man, because he says the sexes share so much, and that in a man, it's just that the masculine genes, he says, are greater and tip the scale. So presumably accepting the anima is incorporating kind of the rest, this like genetic minority in yourself. And yet it's this spirit that's kind of above too. Like, there's this genetic below, and the crude feminine that he says is a conservative that doesn't differentiate between beauty and the good, that they're always together. But then there's also this kind of Sophia version with this hidden wisdom. which is this, it comes with, I guess, the spirit that's breathed into man. It's the animating soul. Man otherwise is this like lifeless matter that isn't animated. And then we come to my favorite part. He's actually saying that that this image of the divine feminine, this goddess, he says in the lecture, a goddess, that it should remain a goddess in some sense. And he said for medieval man, this was the queen of heaven. Of course, he's referring to the Theotokos. And he says, without this, a Western man who's iconoclastic, who's kind of desymbolized his life world, now projects the ideal feminine on actual women. And so basically he's talking about simping. And then he says how the divorce rates have gone up, and that Europe is catching up with America on that front. Yeah, very interesting part. So in other words, this anima, which is like Eve, and Eve means life, is supposed to remain a symbol or some, as we would say, an actual ideal figure, a saint, the saint of saints, the Theotokos. Otherwise, it has to go somewhere. You have to see it somewhere. It's really interesting. Of course, before the explicit Christian revelation, the Jews had the Ark of the Covenant, which would be the equivalent, or maybe I shouldn't say equivalent, but the type. Right, okay, and then paragraph 66, he starts speaking of the archetype of meaning, which is separate from this archetype of life, or is distinct. And he talks about another dream, which includes this, black magician who's wearing white, and the white magic magician who's wearing black. And he speaks of a further surrender and helplessness. This time he speaks of a death and crossing a desert. And this death, in paragraph 69, he's saying is the death of the king. Now, the king is basically your symbolic order, your cosmos or ordered world. And he even calls it a valid principle that regulates life, expresses life. But to Jung, there's this natural opposition of this to beauty, or the sleeping beauty. In the dream, the old man or king has to die and is looking to be buried, and finds the tomb of a virgin, and maybe once that is opened, I think once that's opened, the sleeping beauty or virgin becomes a black horse, which symbolizes the passions, and then runs off. And then the dreamer, I think, has to cross a desert to find this horse, which is in a like a paradise across from the desert, and they find the key of the keys to paradise with this horse, or something like that. But the way Jung interprets this is what's interesting. He says that the king has to die for the sleeping beauty to arise. I think that's the main point for him. There's this kill the king ritual kind of going on here. Again, the inevitability of the symbolic order, becoming too old, not mapping onto the fluid reality enough, has to go. So there has to be the death of the king, on his view, which is, I don't know if you guys know what with that, uh, who has that idea, the death of the king ritual. Yeah, so that's kind of a further facing of the self, right? And after that, starts talking about the old man slash Lucifer, who's also the divine youth, and the kind of reconciliation of all opposites. So the integrated self. And then he starts talking about the symbolic process in general, is that some impossible situation happens in your life which begins this process, and there's the goal already of illumination here. And what you should do is resist dissociating the conscious from the unconscious. Instead, there should be this dialectic process or dialogue process of integration of the unconscious into the conscious by way of the conscious. And that's the process he calls individuation. And the unconscious contents are supposed to be synthesized with consciousness. So you're supposed to find that dialectic synthesis. And then you're supposed to follow up. So this is all like a process of recognizing, and he says you're supposed to follow it up with the appropriate action, which takes moral effort. It's the neurotic who doesn't take this effort, and he says, yeah, you're not necessarily going to be taking the right action in response to this. Okay, so in some just some general comments that before I dive further into Jung, what I've seen so far, what I should say so far is that this idea of goodness and evil being silly to Jung and wanting to get beyond it, there's two ways you can interpret that, right? There's the edgelord way of interpreting it, which is really, or your, Crowleyan types who identify something which is really wrong. We have these morally loaded concepts like murder or adultery or theft, right? And you can always locate something that is clearly wrong in your intuition. And the idea that you then need to do that to achieve some kind of balance in yourself is ridiculous. It's Crowleyan, kind of Satanism. But there's another way you can interpret that, which is that the good doesn't always look good, that the good is, in fact, more powerful and dangerous than evil, as we would see it. God is omnipotent, not just the good. In that case, we have something more like Aristotle's concept. I should back up before I get to that. Nietzsche, before Jung, was talking about how the good is really like the blonde beast that has strength necessarily. And, we have Jordan Peterson in this line of thought, from Nietzsche to Jung to Jordan Peterson, talking about how meekness or gentleness is really not a virtue if you can't inflict pain. But this goes back, I'm sure, to Plato, but I'm more familiar with it in Aristotle, who says the just man, someone is just in case they can give what is due. So to one person, what is due is rewards, and what is due to another person is punishments. So the just man is able to mete out the punishments, inflict the pain and suffering, and to give rewards and honors. that's a virtue, justice. Um, so, but you see, that's a very different thing. Um, that's the unity of goodness and power or strength that we've lost in the West since I don't know, since the split of the separation of church and state, really. Um, I would refer the listener to 8 Ways to Run the Country, I think it is, by Brian Patrick Mitchell. In that he explains the political diversity in the West, um, by talking about how authority and power came apart. And authority is like right, power or the state is like right. So does might equal right? Was the question since Plato. But he says authority was in the church and power was in the state. And once there was the separation of these two, you got 4 different positions now, depending on whether you accepted both, denied both, or accepted only one or the other. And you get, for the first time, this notion of individualism, where the individual is free from power, and possibly also free from authority, and that freedom from becomes a value in itself. This negative freedom. Yeah, and I would say this is also when you start to get this notion of the powerless good. The church, which is good, we're still supposed to think, but has no power. Okay, I'm not saying anything about we should be theocrats or monarchists or anything about that. I'm not saying that here. Just saying that this split introduced kind of the new. I think Brian Patrick Mitchell is right. That introduced like 4 different positions at that point. In the ancient world, power and authority were always seen as together somehow. So anyway, so as I was saying, Plato, Aristotle, they already had this notion of the just or good man as the strong man. It's not until modernity that we have this notion of like the nice, the good nice, the good being nice, but always kind of, nice guy finishes last and ends up losing out. So it's in this context that we have two things that we could get from Jung. We could go back through Nietzsche to the ancients and an ancient sense of Christianity which accepted that insight I just mentioned from Aristotle. Or we could, accept the modern notion and then throw it all away and think that we need to be evil or something, which is a complete confusion. So instead of seeing it like this, it's through the mind, through a kind of rationality by which I see, through discernment, by which I see that this person deserves punishment, right? It's his due. How do you figure that out to begin with, right? Instead of that, it's like either I don't even pay attention to that, the discernment to be able to tell, in ratio or proportion. Like I don't even pay attention to that. I just feel myself as, not balanced out enough. So I'm going to do a whole bunch of this other, acting mean, getting in confrontations, blah, 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 to try to balance myself out. Or you're saying like, I'm going to identify something as like pretty clearly wrong and then do that. That's it's always been this ambiguity that I've seen in this strain of thinking from Peterson, which like it could go one of two ways. I would really recommend, of course, the way into the church and having a spiritual father or like a guide, somebody you can trust, somebody who can tell you how it is, but they're not going to like enjoy inflicting pain in some weird way. I mean, it is interesting because the virtuous man enjoys doing what's virtuous, and if part of virtue is inflicting pain, then it would seem like they're sadists, right? But I think that the psyche is pretty complex. You can enjoy being just, but at the same time not enjoy inflicting pain and you know so but it's obviously that's complicated. Right, but I just mean like you should have guides. You should have some trusted usually older men, trusted because they can, like I said, tell you how it is, but aren't they're trying to do that for your good. They actually care about your good, right? But they're also going to recognize your psychological limits, and they're not going to drive you away with mockery and insults, because everyone has their limits with that. Um, so yeah, it can get really personal and bad, and you might have to experience that to be able to discern for yourself who's a good guide and who's not. In the end, you kind of decide that, which is paradoxical. Anyway, I've rambled too much. That's the first essay, or I should say lecture, from Jung, Archetypes of the Collective Unconscious. And I'm going to see if I can do, I'll want to do more on Jung after this.